Welcome. It is Verdict with Ted Cruz, the Weekend Review. Ben Ferguson with you. And here are the big stories that you may have missed that we talked about. First up, what is next for Venezuela after Donald Trump went in to get one of the biggest narco-terrorists in the world? We'll have the answer to that for you in just a moment. Also, Democrats were actually in favor of getting Maduro and demanding it, even having money on the line for those that would turn him in. But now they hate Donald Trump because he got him. What's behind all that? And finally, the Minnesota government, including the governor now, says he wants to go to civil war with the federal government. It's the Weekend Review, and it starts right now. What is next? And let me just, I could look at my Twitter feed, and I was on CNN last night, and it was the topic of conversation, and that is, there are a lot of people that believe that America First policy that Donald Trump ran on was not invading countries and staying indefinitely like Iraq, Afghanistan. There is a lot of concern. I heard it. You probably saw the clip of Lindsey Graham on Air Force One with the president saying, you know, this is a guy that loves to be in these forever wars. And there was people that were really concerned with that image of if that's who's in his ear. I don't want to get bogged down in Venezuela. I don't want our men and women to be there and loss of life to mount and grow because we decide to take over a country indefinitely. There's a lot of people that voted for Trump. They believe that's what he was never going to do. And now they're like, well, hold on. We're here. We're going to take it over. There is a lot of concern. So let's dive into that and talk about what this looks like next in Venezuela. What is responsibility? What responsibility do we have to do it the right way, but also to not just sit there indefinitely?
Well, listen, first of all, let me be clear. We are not at war with Venezuela. Yeah. This is not a forever war. It's not even a war. This was a military operation to execute an arrest warrant. It was the military supporting the FBI in arresting indicted narco-terrorists. And it took a couple of hours and was over. They went in, they got them, and they left. That was the conclusion of the military conflict. It's not a war. It's not. As I said, it's not a forever war. It was not even a 5-hour war. It was about a 2-hour war. Yeah. And I wouldn't even call it a war. It was when you go and arrest someone. It was an arrest with the military supporting and protecting the law enforcement officers carrying out the arrest. What happens next? So the day after Maduro was arrested, Delcy Rodríguez, who was the vice president, was sworn in as the interim president. Now, listen. No American should be happy with Delcy Rodríguez as the president of Venezuela for any extended period of time. And I'm going to go into a little bit of background in terms of who she is and then talk about what should happen next. Now, Delcy Rodríguez is a communist.
Yes.
She was the vice president. She hates America. Let me give you some of her background. She was the vice president. Before that, she was the oil minister. And she is a lawyer, too, like the First Lady, and she's been in just about every post. She was foreign minister, she was president of the Constituent Assembly, vice president and oil minister. She was sworn in as the interim president. You know who swore in?
Who's that?
Her brother, Jorge Rodríguez, who is the head of the National Assembly. So to understand, this is a corrupt Marxist, communist, America-hating woman. And let me give you her background. She was born in Caracas. She is the daughter of a Marxist guerrilla leader named Jorge Antonio Rodríguez. And she is, rather, her dad was a co-founder of the Socialist League. Her dad was arrested in connection with the 1976 kidnapping of American businessman William F. Niehaus and died in police custody. And one source said the following: that ordeal is the foundation and origin of Delcy's hatred of the West and of democracy. Her whole background was Marxist. And in fact, the source continued, the guerrilla Marxist element kidnapped an American executive in 1976. He was held for 3 years until authorities located the group hiding in the Amazon jungle. She was sanctioned by the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Asset Control because of her senior role in the Maduro administration. Those sanctions are still in place. She was also caught transporting gold illegally into Spain. She had 40 bags, 40 bags full of gold in a private jet as the vice president. And they put the bags through the x-ray. They said, wait, you got 40 bags full of gold. And she's
like, I'm from Venezuela. This is normal. This is how we operate there. I'm the vice president, right? Like, that's no big deal.
Look, she is a communist leader, and she is not a friend of the West. Now, I will say this. Right now, it appears she's cooperating with the Trump administration. I'm sure it made an impression seeing Delta Force show up and arrest Maduro and the First Lady.
Yeah, because she could be next.
She's cooperating right now. We'll see if she continues to cooperate. By the way, there are multiple reports of violence on the ground. There have been reports of potential coups from other leaders in the government. There is some instability, but I'll tell you what needs to happen. No one should be happy. Number one, what you said is exactly right. We do not want to see an American occupation. We don't want to see an extended American presence on the ground. And we don't want to see this America-hating communist essentially the Maduro regime continuing. What should happen is free and fair elections. And free and fair elections. Look, the last election, we talked about in the last podcast that Maduro was arrested because he's a narco-trafficker, but he was also arrested because he's illegitimate, because in the last election he lost decisively to the opposition party, and yet he stayed in power just as a thug and dictator. And that was part of the legal basis for why we could do this, because he was no longer legitimately a head of state, and he was not recognized as a head of state by the United States, including the Biden administration and much of the rest of the world. There should be free and fair elections, and I think it would be very, very good for Venezuela and very, very good for America if they were to elect a leader who is a pro-America, pro-free market leader, and Venezuela were to return to being a friend, particularly, look, one of the big things, they've got the largest proven oil reserves of any country in the world.
It really is amazing that if you think about the amount of oil they have and also gold, that how quickly they could come out of this if they just didn't have communists running the country. Like this would be one of the easiest. I was described today by a banker, and he was just trying to put it in perspective. He's like, when other countries fall, then they need the World Bank. They need people to come in and give them cash and to help just stabilize at the bare minimum of a total collapse of their economy. He said, if you ask me right now, what country would I want to be able to take over based on their resources to build them back up the fastest? He was like, Venezuela is like one of the easiest ones in the whole world to do because of how much they have to sell. They could get their economy up and roaring, and the people could have a great life. And they used to have that, by the way, in Venezuela. People forget that.
Yeah, remember in 1950, Venezuela had the fourth highest GDP per capita in the world. The United States was first, then Switzerland, then New Zealand, and Venezuela was number 4. That's what these communists screwed up. And listen, President Trump has focused a great deal on trying to get U.S. oil companies to go and invest in Venezuela. Now, to produce the oil, and even though they have proven reserves, their infrastructure has collapsed. It's the corruption of the communism. They're not producing what they could. And to be able to produce will take an investment of likely hundreds of billions of dollars. It's not a cheap proposition. Now, the oil that will be produced would generate more revenue than that. But I'll tell you, I actually spent a good chunk of the day talking to people in the energy industry and asking their views on Venezuela. And a big question that if let's say you're the CEO of Chevron or the CEO of ExxonMobil and you're trying to decide, do I invest tens of billions or hundreds of billions? Your number one question is, what's the government there? Are they stable? Is there rule of law? Are they going to protect me? Or are they going to seize? Am I going to invest $100 billion and they come seize the assets like they did before? If you don't trust the government there to protect your property rights, you're not going to invest. And it's why having free and fair elections and a stable government that is friends of the United States, that is not communist, is critical to the success, not just of Venezuela, but to the success of America's relationship with Venezuela. And so I will say, there's some folks you're seeing people who are saying, well, no, this was not regime change because we just arrested Maduro, but the exact same regime is in place. And let me be clear. This, I very much hope, will be regime change at the ballot box, which is a very different thing. That it will be the voters, that there will be a free and fair elections, and the voters will choose. We don't want these corrupt Marxist narco-traffickers. We want a leader that we choose to represent us and to bring us back to prosperity. And if you want prosperity in Venezuela, you want free enterprise, you want incentives for investment to develop the massive natural resources, and you want to trade with the United States of America. And so that's the outcome all of us should be rooting for. And I believe that's the outcome President Trump is working very hard to produce.
Now, if you want to hear the rest of this conversation, you can go back and listen to the full podcast from earlier this week. Now on to story number 2. I want to go back. Can we go back to Chuck Schumer and just... I think it was 2020 when he had something very interesting to say. Can we play that for everybody real quick?
Yep.
All right, take a listen. This is Chuck Schumer back in 2020. Listen carefully to the words that he has to say. You're going to get a kick out of this.
He brags about all these things he wants to do or is doing, but his actions belie his words. Maybe the best metaphor was his claim to bring democracy to Venezuela. There was a big policy there. It flopped. If the policy was working, Juan Guaido wouldn't be in the balcony here. He'd be in Venezuela. He'd be sitting in the president's palace, or at least waging a fight to win. He's here. And the president brags about his Venezuela policy? Give us a break. He hasn't brought an end to the Maduro regime. The Maduro regime is more powerful today and more entrenched today than it was when the president began.
So here's my part about this that makes me laugh. Democrats, and there's a tweet that's very much like that, the same thing from Joe Biden.
Yep.
They were angry that Trump hadn't taken out Maduro. Now Trump takes out Maduro, and now they're angry at Trump for taking out Maduro. You cannot make it up.
Yeah, and listen carefully to what Schumer just said there. Give us a break. He hasn't ended the Maduro regime. So he was on the floor of the Senate. This is a speech where he was blasting Trump in 2020 for not having taken Maduro out. And now, in the wake of President Trump having another enormously successful military operation, that lasted just a few hours in actual execution, and then it was over, and then Maduro was gone, and he was on his way to the United States. Schumer and Kamala Harris and just about every Democrat you find are freaking out, and they're just being hypocrites. They just hate Trump, and just like they're defending every illegal immigrant, they're defending all of the gangbangers who are here. In this case, the Democrats are becoming the chief defender of Nicolás Maduro. But as I mentioned, on the legal front, if you look back to Noriega, front and center in terms of the litigation that will happen over this is that in 1989, Bill Barr was the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel. Now, Bill Barr, you'll recall, ended up becoming George Herbert Walker Bush's Attorney General, and then he was also AG for President Trump in the first term. Bill Barr at the time was leading what's called OLC, and OLC is charged under federal law with writing authoritative opinions on what is the Constitution, what is legal, what are the constraints on the executive branch. And by the way, there is a long history of incredibly important jurists and scholars being the heads of OLC, including Antonin Scalia. He was the head of OLC, including William Rehnquist, for whom I clerked, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was the head of OLC under Nixon, including Chuck Cooper, my first boss when I practiced law. So OLC, they are often U.S. Supreme Court clerks themselves. They are constitutional experts. And Barr issued a detailed opinion making clear that the U.S. government had the authority to go and apprehend Noriega. And Barr said several things. So it's a detailed opinion. By the way, you can read the entire opinion. The opinion is public. But Barr concluded that, number one, the FBI's statutory arrest authority, quote, authorizes extraterritorial investigations and arrests. So that's in the statute, existing U.S. law. The FBI can go abroad and arrest someone. And Barr concluded the president can lawfully order that extraterritorial arrest. And interestingly, Barr, so one of the main arguments that Democrats in the media, although that's redundant because they're one and the same, Democrats in the media, and by the way, law professors fall into that same camp. They're all clutching their pearls. And their main argument deals with the United Nations Charter. And Article 2.4 of the UN Charter prohibits the, quote, use of force against the territorial integrity of any state. And so their main argument is this violates the UN Charter. Well, what Barr concluded, and this is a quote, and by the way, it's not just Barr's opinion. This is a binding decision from OLC that binds the executive unless and until it's overturned. So it is like a judicial opinion, but within the executive branch. Barr said that Article 2.4 of the UN Charter does not, quote, prohibit the executive as a matter of domestic law from authorizing forcible abductions. Put another way, quote, as a matter of domestic law, the executive has the power to authorize actions inconsistent with Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. What does that mean? The UN Charter is not independently binding on the United States government. The Constitution is binding on the government. You know, back before I was in the Senate, what I did for a living is argued U.S. Supreme Court cases. And the most consequential case that I argued before the Supreme Court was a case called Medellin versus Texas. I ended up winning 6-3. It was an incredibly consequential case, but it dealt with the authority of the International Court of Justice, the World Court, the judicial arm of the UN, to bind the U.S. justice system. And I argued, representing the state of Texas successfully, the UN doesn't have the authority to do that. The World Court doesn't have the authority to do it. It is the U.S. Constitution and it is U.S. laws. And if Congress wants to pass a law, that can be binding, but Congress had not in Medellin passed a law relevant to the issue there. Likewise here, the DOJ opinion was even if the UN Charter says something different, as a matter of U.S. constitutional law, the president can order this. And critically, the Barr opinion also concluded that a U.S. arrest abroad, quote, in violation of foreign law, does not violate the Fourth Amendment. And to be clear, the Barr opinion was litigated in the Noriega case, and Noriega stayed in jail, so he lost all of those claims. That is really powerful legal precedent, and it is very closely on point.
You talk about the legal side of this. I want to ask just real quickly, are there other legal aspects and challenges in this case that could come up as well?
Well, yes, and look, there are distinctions that I would expect Maduro to argue between this case and the Noriega case. In the Noriega case, the General Assembly in Panama had actually declared war on the United States. Secondly, they had shot and killed a U.S. Marine. And so those are both facts that leaned in favor of Noriega, the president being able to respond militarily. In this instance, the government of Venezuela has not formally declared war on the United States, and they have not killed a Marine or a service member, although Maduro's drug trafficking has killed countless Americans. Thousands and hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions. A massive number of Americans Maduro is responsible for killing through drug trafficking. I will say also there is a second issue that will be litigated, which is what's called head of state immunity. So Maduro will go and argue that the actions he carried out were as the leader of Venezuela. And as a general principle, U.S. government, U.S. courts don't impose criminal liability for the actions a head of state does. And Noriega was the de facto leader of Panama, but he was not elected by the people. In this case, the guy was recognized as a head of state, and so it's different from Noriega. That will be litigated. I think the response to that is fine. That may have been, he may have enjoyed that immunity back in 2017, 2018. But 2019, when he ignored the results of the election and seized power illegitimately, everyone agrees he was illegitimate. The United States, by the way, the Biden administration agreed that. The first Trump administration agreed that. Most of the rest of the world has acknowledged that that Maduro stayed in power illegitimately. One exception from head of state immunity is if the government invites you in. In this case, I think you would say there's not an operational government that is legitimate, that he was an illegitimate dictator, but that will be a subject of litigation. It would not surprise me to see that question go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court.
All right, and finally, I know I'm going to laugh because I know you're going to have an answer for this. Are there any other legal precedents that are going to come up in here as well as we wrap up the legal side of this?
There are, and there's a line of cases that's known as the Kerr-Frisbee doctrine, which says that unlawful abductions of criminals on foreign soil does not stop the criminal prosecution of those individuals in U.S. courts. And the lead case in this line of cases is a case called the United States versus Alvarez Machain. It was a 1992 ruling. And the Supreme Court 6-3 concluded that a Mexican national who was forcibly abducted in Mexico from his home, brought to the United States, that he could be criminally prosecuted. It didn't matter if his being seized abroad was illegally. And so that line of cases, if Maduro were just a run-of-the-mill drug dealer, it would be a very easy question that regardless of the circumstances of his capture, if he violated U.S. criminal laws, he could be prosecuted here. And so that line of cases, I think, will be relevant. And again, all the folks on TV claiming this is illegal are ignoring both the Constitution and Supreme Court precedent, not to mention the binding DOJ opinion from 1989.
As before, if you want to hear the rest of this conversation on this topic, you can go back and download the podcast from earlier this week to hear the entire thing. I want to get back to the big story, number 3 of the week you may have missed. Senator, I want to go back to just the rhetoric here, and we mentioned the governor earlier. The governor, Tim Walz, is now a disgraced governor. He had to drop out of his reelection campaign because of the fraud that is just continuing to grow in the dollar amount and the different sectors of the government. I'm not sure there's any sector in Minnesota that wasn't involved in fraud and corruption at this point. We're seeing it in transportation, childcare, the list goes on and on. But the governor now seems to think this is like a moment to seize on, and he's now wanting to go to war with the federal government. It's very odd.
Yeah, look, the Democrat politicians in Minnesota are in crisis right now because this Somali fraud it is the worst instance of fraud that has ever been uncovered in American history. $9 billion and counting, massive theft from the taxpayers. It is so bad that Tim Walz, I mean, remember like 12 minutes ago, the Democrats said he was going to be vice president of the United States. And now he's ended his campaign for re-election even as governor because, I think he's facing potentially very real criminal liability for the fraud that unfolded under his leadership. And it is, and Walz and the mayor in Minneapolis, that they're not the only ones. I think there's an entire array of Democrats who are responsible. And one of the reasons why they are so eager to foment riots, I mean, look, they are rooting for a replay of the Black Lives Matter and the Antifa riots we saw all over the country. They want people going to the streets. They want them looting stores. They want them firebombing police cars. They are rooting for violence because they want to energize their voters and get everyone not talking about the fraud. Here's Tim Walz, the governor, and here was his response, calling for all-out war.
Well, I said this yesterday. We've never been at war with our federal government. I think in this case that the National Guard is their main mission. They have a dual mission.
When he said that and it went viral, I'm like, let me get this straight. You have a governor who is in a crisis situation. I'm talking about the crisis on the ground, whose job is to back law enforcement, and his job is also to ratchet down the rhetoric so we don't have a civil war breakout. And he's like, maybe this is an opportunity for a civil war. He's saying that Minnesota is at war with the United States federal government. The governor just said that.
Yeah, and listen, if you're an angry left-wing radical, you already hate ICE, you already hate Donald Trump, and then you hear the elected Democrat governor say, Minnesota is at war with the federal government. That is a call to violence. That is a call in war. people get killed, people get injured. That is Democrats very deliberately calling to violence. It is not we disagree over policy with the federal government. It is we are at war. And I think a huge part of this is a CYA instinct.
Yes.
Because the fraud is so bad. And I want you to listen. The House of Representatives had a hearing on the fraud in Minnesota. By the way, I'm going to be chairing a hearing on the same topic in just a couple of weeks. So we'll cover that in verdict when that happens. But I want you to listen to Brandon Gill. Brandon Gill's a good friend. He is a congressman from Texas. He's cross-examining this left-wing witness from Minnesota. I want you to listen to this exchange. It's really powerful.
Thank you for being here. Let me ask you, does large-scale Somali immigration make Minnesota stronger or weaker?
Certainly stronger.
Certainly stronger. Do you know what percentage of Somali-headed households in Minnesota are on food stamps?
No.
54%. Do you know what that number is for native Minnesota-headed households?
Well, to be clear, a majority of the...
It's 7%. There's a big difference between 54% and 7%, is there not?
Excuse me, sir, could I answer the question?
Let me move on. We've got a lot of questions here. What percentage of Somali-headed households in Minnesota are on Medicaid?
I don't know.
It's 73%. Do you know what that number is for Minnesota native households?
Again, you're using the phrase Minnesota native households, but the majority...
The number is 18%. That's quite an astounding difference. I think we would agree.
Can I answer the question, please?
Let me ask you one more, and then we can go on to that. What percentage of Somali-headed households are on welfare in general?
I don't know.
It's 81%. What about... let me just ask you, after 10 years of being in the United States, what percentage of Somali immigrant households continue to be on welfare?
I don't know.
The number is 78%. So even after 10 years, 78% of Somali immigrant households continue to be on welfare. Do you know what that number is for native Minnesota-headed households?
Again, you're using
non-Somali immigrant-headed households.
If I can just answer the question, when you're using the phrase native Minnesotans, the majority of Somali Minnesotans are as Minnesotan as any of us. They were born in the United States. It's only 8,000 of the 108,000 Somali.
Nevertheless, the welfare usage is astoundingly different. Let me ask you again, does that make Minnesota stronger or weaker?
Again, I'd like the opportunity to answer the question here.
Go for
it. Again, the majority of Somali Minnesotans are born in the United States, as I understand it.
Okay, well, what percentage of working-age Somalians who have been in the U.S. for 10 years or more, how many of them speak English very well?
I don't know.
About half. The answer is about half. That seems pretty low, doesn't it?
I love just the facts there, Senator. Like the way that he handled that, it's the reason why you're good friends with him. It's the reason why we played it, because he's just laying out the reality of the situation on the ground and how we got to a point where virtually every government program in Minnesota has been compromised by the Somali community in this way, where they could grab money and create fraud with it.
But by the way, Brandon got elected. He had a rough primary. He had a bunch of primary opponents. He had millions of dollars spent against him. Brandon is a conservative. Actually, his father-in-law is Dinesh D'Souza, who's a good friend. And I endorsed Brandon early, went and campaigned with him, and he overcame a ton of money coming against him. And part of what I told the voters of Texas is, listen, if y'all elect Brandon, he's going to go and fight for you and make you proud. He's doing that. I want to make a point about the back and forth, because that weaselly Minnesota lefty witness, he kept saying, well, the majority of Somalians are born in America. Now note what Brandon Gill was asking, Somali immigrant-headed households, and the guy says, well, they have a bunch of anchor babies. In other words, we bring over Somali immigrants.
Yeah.
They have tons of babies here, and because of birthright citizenship, which is a really foolish policy, and my hope is that the Supreme Court will side with President Trump in ending it. But the Somali immigrants come here. They have a lot of babies here. That guy's focusing on the babies, and Brandon's saying, all right, how about the person who heads the household? And the person who heads the household are these Somali immigrants, and you've got 81% of them on welfare. And I tell you, the stat that was really powerful was 10 years later. They've been here 10 years. It's 78% still on welfare. This is a scam. The Democrats did it deliberately, and they did it to buy votes. They were importing votes to vote for Democrats. They allowed them to commit fraud, to steal $9 billion, and then to bundle those votes for the Democrats, to bundle cash for the Democrats, and the Democrats covered it up. And it's why Tim Walz and Jacob Frey and so many other Democrats are trying to enrage the left about this shooting with ICE, because they want to cover up from the incredible theft and fraud they're responsible for.
As always, thank you for listening to Verdict with Senator Ted Cruz. Ben Ferguson with you. Don't forget to download my podcast, so you can listen to my podcast every other day you're not listening to Verdict, or each day when you listen to Verdict afterwards. I'd love to have you as a listener to, again, the Ben Ferguson podcast, and we will see you back here on Monday morning.